December 25th, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. After 74 years, the world's largest communist state ceases to exist. What comes next is economic chaos unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. But somehow, over the following decade and beyond, Russia didn't disappear into history. It came back. Today we're asking, how did Russia recover its economy after 1991? To understand the recovery, you first need to understand how bad things got. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited 60% of its territory and population, but also its debts, its dysfunction, and its fundamentally broken economic model. The Soviet economy ran on central planning. The state decided what was produced, how much of it, and at what price. There was no real markets, there was no private ownership, there was barely a concept of profit. And when that system evaporated overnight, Russia was left with nothing to replace it. By 1992, inflation hit 2,500%. Prices for basic goods, bread, milk, medicine were rising so fast that workers would rush to spend their wages the moment they received them, because by the following week that money might be worth half as much. Industrial output collapsed by nearly 40% between 1991 and 1998. Real incomes fell off a cliff. The poverty rate, once officially non-existent in the USSR, surged past 35%. This period had a name. Russians called it the Wild 90s, and wild it was. Russia's new government, led by Boris Yeltsin, turned into a controversial strategy, shock therapy. The idea, championed by American economist Jeffrey Sachs and embraced by the IMF and World Bank, was simple in theory. If you want a market economy, create one. Fast, rip off the bandage, liberalize prices, privatize state enterprises, and open up the foreign trade all at once. In January 1992, the Russian government lifted price control on most goods. Inflation exploded. Then came mass privatization, the most ambitious transfer of state assets into private hands in history. The mechanism? Vouchers. Every Russian citizen received a voucher worth 10,000 rubles. Theoretically, their share of the Soviet economy. In principle, you could use these to buy shares in factories, companies, and enterprises being sold off by the state. In practice, most Russians had no idea what to do with them. Many sold their vouchers for cash, desperately needed cash, often at a fraction of their theoretical value. And who was there to buy them up? A small group of politically connected businessmen who would become known as the oligarchs. The rise of the oligarchs is one of the most remarkable and controversial chapters in Russian economic story. Through a combination of political connections, clever maneuvering, and in some cases outright fraud, a group of men acquired extraordinary wealth in an extraordinarily short time. The most infamous mechanism was the loans of shares scheme of 1995. Facing a budget crisis, the Yeltsin government borrowed money from private banks and used shares in major state companies as collateral. When the government inevitably defaulted on those loans, the banks which had designed the scheme took ownership of Russia's most valuable assets: oil companies, metal producers, media empires. Overnight, men like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had started a bank barely 5 years earlier, became one of the richest people on earth. By the late 1990s, 7 oligarchs were estimated to control up to 50% of Russia's entire economy. Just when it seemed things might stabilize, disaster struck again. In August 1998, Russia defaulted on its government debt and devalued the ruble. The currency lost 2/3 of its value in weeks. Banks collapsed, savings were wiped out. The government was effectively bankrupt. For many observers, this looked like the end. Russia seemed ungovernable, economically irreparable. But then something unexpected happened. The devaluation, catastrophic as it was, made Russian goods dramatically cheaper on global markets. Domestic industry, suddenly competitive, began to revive. And just as Russia was hitting rock bottom, oil prices started to rise. Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, and for the next decade, he presided over an extraordinary economic turnaround, one that was equal parts policy, luck, and oil. Crude oil prices, which had hovered around $10 a barrel in 1998, climbed steadily to over $100 a barrel in the mid-2000s. For a country with the world's largest natural gas reserves and one of its largest oil supplies, this was transformative. Between 2000 and 2008, Russia's GDP grew by 7% per year on average. Real wages doubled. Poverty fell from 35% to under 14%. Russia paid off its IMF debts early. It accumulated a stabilization fund, a sovereign wealth buffer against future culture shocks. Moscow was transformed, luxury malls, gleaming skyscrapers, and the emergence of a Russian middle class. Putin also moved against the oligarchs selectively. Those who stayed out of politics kept their wealth. Those who didn't, like Khodorkovsky, who had begun funding opposition parties, found themselves facing criminal persecution. The message was clear. Business was fine as long as it didn't challenge the Kremlin. But here's the thing about an oil boom. It can mask deep problems. Russia's economic revival was heavily dependent on one thing: commodity prices. Oil, gas, and raw materials accounted over 60% of export revenues. Russia had essentially become a petro-state, wealthy when prices were high, vulnerable when they weren't. Manufacturing remained weak, domestic technology lagged, corruption measured by Transparency International as among the world's worst deterred investment and stifled entrepreneurship, and demographic challenges, low birth rate, high mortality, brain drain weighed on long-term potential. Every time oil prices dipped in 2008, in 2014, in 2020, the Russian economy contracted sharply, exposing just how shallow the recovery really was. So, did Russia recover? In narrow terms, yes. GDP per capita rose dramatically, poverty fell, infrastructure improved. Russia reasserted itself as a global economic and geopolitical power. But the recovery was uneven, dependent on commodity windfalls, and built on a political economy that concentrated wealth and power at the top. The wild 90s gave way to a stable 2000s, but stability came at a cost: the suppression of the very competitive, pluralistic market economy that reformers had once envisioned. Russia's story after 1991 is one of resilience, but also of roads not taken, of a country that survived the collapse of its entire economic system and rebuilt something new, just not quite what anyone had planned. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more.